my topic this afternoon, I was discussing my research paper focused on presidents and their family backgrounds. And it's an examination of how presidential backgrounds can affect a person's rise to power, and then also how the individuals conduct themselves once they're in office. Now, one of the traps that we fall into when we're looking at presidents and the past leaders that we've had in this country is that it's somewhat homogeneous in nature. If you look at the past 47 presidents, up until 2008, they were all white males. Now, if you delve into it a little bit deeper, you'll find that some of their backgrounds can produce very diverse candidates and produce very different policy agendas once they get there. And the two that I kind of narrowed down through the country's history are presidents that have specific backgrounds and different policy strategies coming from a family background in politics, and almost dynastical sense, where it's something that they always grew up with and were surrounded by, such as John F. Kennedy or George W. Bush, and then homegrown politicians who didn't have this kind of upbringing, like Reagan and Clinton, for instance, and about how they, although these two pairs, most people would say couldn't be more different from each other, actually had very similar ways that they conducted themselves in office. So we'll start with agenda presidents, which is related to the family background presidents. That when they get into office, they have a set of agenda items that they hope to complete by the end of their 8 years. They're almost already predicting that they're going to be in for the full term. Kennedy, one of his main focuses by default was the Cold War, because that was right as the Cold War and the arms race was ratcheting up. Bush, on the other hand, kind of tripped into his policy agenda, which was stabling the Middle East, and then later after September 11th, going after al-Qaeda and different regimes, such as the Hussein regime, who they figured could present a security risk by giving them their weapons of mass destruction to these terrorist organizations. They both had very distinct successes that they achieved as a means of their policy direction. Kennedy had the successful dealing of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then further developing and putting an emphasis on the NASA space program in order to prove the technological superiority over the Soviet Union. And then on the other hand, with Bush, he had successes toppling the Taliban and the Hussein regimes as a result of trying to quell this war on terror. They both did have setbacks along the way, however. Kennedy had the Bay of Pigs fiasco, and then George W. Bush himself had the controversy as far as the intelligence regarding weapons of mass destruction, like with the picture on the right. And one of the things that is striking about the way that they conduct themselves in their office and their policy directions is that even though they had these setbacks that kind of put them in a more critical light with the public, they maintained along their presidency have the kind of I'm decider mentality of when they come across a discrepancy or something that stands in the way of their policy, they either find a way to adapt to it or just blow right through it and keep on going with their overall policy agenda. Kennedy's is a little more subject to discrepancy from that merely because he was assassinated before he was elected again and could serve out the last 4 years like Bush did. And kind of back on the topic of, before we get into the homegrown presidents, a lot of what I found in my research is that the attitude to push their agenda through and not waver on the overall direction of that was due to a lot of things that they grew up with during their family. Both of their fathers were very, very successful businessmen. John F. Kennedy's father was a very successful businessman on the East Coast who had to overcome a lot of anti-Irish immigrant sentiment on the East Coast. And despite that, he said that he was going to be a millionaire by the time that he was 35, which he achieved. George W. Bush, on the other hand, had George H.W. Bush, who, when W. was born, they lived on the East Coast. They, after a few years living on the East Coast, they came to Texas, where he built his, made a name for himself in the oil industry, and then followed his father's footsteps into that. At that same point in time, both of them had siblings that died at a very young age. George W. Bush was known for being kind of closed-mouthed, and only in certain circumstances would he tell you about his sister who died of leukemia. And then John F. Kennedy, on the other hand, had his oldest brother, who is typically viewed as the favorite, die in World War II, and it was at his father's urging that he first got into politics. And so these agenda presidents come into office with a little bit of a chip on their shoulder. They come in with an idea of what they want to do, and they don't really waver from it despite public outcry or public resistance to their plans. Homegrown presidents are a little bit different. Now, going into the backgrounds a little bit of Reagan and Clinton, they both were born in a little bit more humble backgrounds. They weren't poor or even lower middle class. They were upper middle class in some cases. I didn't even know this before I started my research, but Clinton is actually the last name of Bill's stepfather. His father died at a very young age in a car accident, and then he took his last name after a few years when his mom remarried. They were both very well educated, and Clinton specifically was part of the American Legion Boys Association, where he met John F. Kennedy on a trip to D.C. Now, what you see with their rise to power is instead of being urged by family, they got involved in local races. Reagan's first victory was in California, where he was from, in a House seat, I believe it was. And then Clinton ran for Congress and lost. He also went back and forth with his governorship in Arkansas as well. He won one term, lost in a midterm, and then ran again when the term election came up and won that time. What you see with them is that they're a little less focused on a partisan ideology or a particular agenda. Reagan himself for a long time was a Democrat. He campaigned for Harry Truman and then later supported Walter Mondale. Maybe it was Goldwater. There was a presidential race that he supported the Republican candidate as a Democrat. And then finally he switched his registration. The thing that's interesting is that when you get into the nitty-gritty of when these two gentlemen were in politics, and particularly in the presidency, they start off going off with their agenda. Reagan instituted fairly large tax decreases, and then Clinton, on the other hand, had loosened regulations on abortion. But as you go through their presidency, they seem to kind of be more willing to compromise. Reagan, as you can see in this picture up here on top, actually passed one of the biggest peacetime tax increases in the history of the country. And if you look at the federal spending level, Mr. Fiscal Conservative spent about 2% over the 40-year average for what the government spending typically was. And then Clinton signed off on the controversial Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy as a means to kind of get along with his Congress better as well. The thing that was most interesting is that they were much more subject to controversy. Bill Clinton obviously had the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and then Ronald Reagan had the Iran-Contra affair, which led to a restructuring of some of the members of his cabinet. The thing that I found most interesting when I looked at the Gallup polls is that the data is a little skewed again because John F. Kennedy was assassinated early in his presidency. But if you look at the two on top, those are your agenda presidencies, and the two on bottom are your more adaptable presidencies. And you can see an overall trend that the agenda presidencies go down while the other ones go up, or remain constant. And that was something that I found last weekend when I was working on this. I was like, why the hell was this not in the paper?